We're adding one final step to taking square roots. Okay, so this one is dealing with quantities. So a quantity, like an example of a quantity, is something like x plus 1 squared. It's that stuff inside parentheses. Okay, so we've had problems like 2x squared plus 5 equals 3. Now we're going to have stuff in parentheses squared, and we'll have to solve. Okay, so our first one is going to be x plus 1 squared equals 9. So this is where we're going to start. We're going to solve this problem. But there's a couple, I guess, steps that we should kind of go through. So the first thing that you want to make sure you have, and you can write steps here, is you want to make sure that the parentheses are alone. So get the parentheses alone, meaning there should be nothing multiplied in front of the parentheses, and there should be nothing added or subtracted after parentheses. Okay, the parentheses need to be alone. So that's our first step. Now, here, is there anything multiplied out front? No. Is there anything added or subtracted at the end? No. So our parentheses are alone. That's what it should look like. Okay. Step 2 is going to be to take the square root, just like we've been doing. So if I take the square root of both sides, what is the square root of x plus 1 squared? X plus 1, because the square and the square root cancel, just like it has been. Okay, so we're left with just what's inside the parentheses, the x plus 1, and what's the square root of 9?
3.
Okay, so we can't forget our plus or minus. We're still solving. Okay, so I took the square root of both sides. I'm left with x plus 1 equals plus or minus 3. Everyone okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm not quite done, because what's the problem? You have to get x by itself. So we're going to add that here. Get variable alone. And what would I do to get the x by itself? Subtract 1 from both sides. Now I want you to write this step, because I'm going to show you what happens. So these ones cancel, leaving me with x. Now, how many answers have we gotten every single time? 2. We had a plus minus, right? Now in this case, I can actually tell you what my 2 answers are, because I have a positive 3 minus that 1, and I have a negative 3 minus that 1. What is 3 minus 1? 2. Oh. And then what is negative 3 minus 1? Negative 4. So we're actually writing 2 separate answers. It's not just a plus minus. That confused you. Okay, so let's go back. So are we okay with subtracting 1? Now, do you agree that this means, if I just look at this plus minus 3, do you agree that means I have a positive 3 and a negative 3? Right? And then I'm subtracting 1, but I have to subtract it from both. I think if we do a couple, we'll be okay. Okay, so our answers are 2 and negative 4. I still have 2 answers. In this case, though, they're 2 different. It's not just 1 plus 1 minus. Okay, let's try another one. We're going to do a few. So let's do x plus 3 squared equals 16. Oh. So, are my parentheses alone?
Yes.
Yes? So, second step is to take the square root of both sides. What is the square root of x plus 3 squared? X plus 3. And what's the square root of 16? Plus or minus 4. Okay. Then we're going to subtract 3 from both sides to get x by itself. And here we have 2 answers. We have a positive 4 minus 3, and we have a negative 4 minus 3. 4 minus 3 is 1, and negative 4 minus 3 is negative 7. Do you remember dealing with inequalities last year in IM1 and how there were 2 answers for that as well? No, in some cases there were. Okay, never mind. I'm sorry, not any for absolute value. Did you guys do absolute value in IM1? There were 2 answers for absolute value. We don't remember. Okay. Well, then never mind. All right. Why don't you try x minus 2 squared equals 5. Oh, no, don't try this one. We're going to do it together because something's going to happen. This one's a little different. We're going to do it together right now. Okay. So what would have been your first step? What would you have done? Square root. Okay. So we're going to square root. Leaving me with x minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 5. Because 5 is not a perfect square and you can't simplify it. Okay. What would be your next step? How about add 2? Okay, now I want you to stop and watch something for a second. Like what? What would you say it would be?
It would be like plus minus 2 square root of 5.
No, but close.
Plus minus 5.
Okay, so I want you to look at this. Technically, this means the square root of 5 plus 2 and the negative square root of 5 plus 2. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Now, can you combine the square root of 5 and 2 without getting a decimal? No. And we don't want any decimals. Like, we want to keep fractions and we want to keep square roots. So this is how we're going to write our answer. We're going to write it as 2 plus minus the square root of 5. So we're going to bring this 2 out front in front of our plus minus. You can also technically write it as plus minus the square root of 5 plus 2. Okay, both of these are correct. However, you have to be very careful with this one that plus 2 doesn't go underneath the square root. It's separate. So I think it's easier. I also think it's more aesthetically pleasing to write the 2 in front of the plus minus. I would prefer that you do this. If you gave me that, it's not wrong. You were close. Okay, but we can't put it next to the square root because there's a huge difference between adding 2 to the square root of 5 and having 2 square root of 5 as my answer. Okay? There's what? X equals 2 plus or minus. Okay. All right, so what if I gave you, are you okay with that though, how we wrote it? Okay. Yeah, we're going to leave it just like that. What if I gave you this problem? What makes this problem different than the last couple? There's something added to the end of it, right? The parentheses not alone. So we need to deal with that first. So what do I need to move? I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides. I have to get rid of that 1 first. So I'm left with x minus 4 squared equals 9. Now, doesn't that look just like what we've been doing? Okay, so see if you can continue that. Judah, let's go. You did not. Okay, but you're supposed to be writing. Let's go. So once you subtracted 1 from both sides, you then did what? Square root. So x minus 4 equals plus or minus 3. We're going to add 4. And is this the type of problem where I'm going to physically have 2 answers, or am I going to combine it and have a plus minus? We're physically going to have 2 answers because there's no radical. So I have a 3 plus 4 and a negative 3 plus 4, which means x equals 7 and x equals 1. We still okay? This is the hardest part of taking square roots. But if you still follow the same process of solving and getting x by itself, hopefully it's not complicated.
Where's the curveball, Miss Bird?
There isn't one. No.
Yeah, I know.
She always throws a curveball, Miss Bird. This is
No curveball. I mean, well, I don't think this is a curveball, but it's a different, it's like I'm adding something. Okay, so we're going to do this one together, and then I'm going to have you try one. So, what's different about this problem compared to the other ones? There's 2 things that are in our way. I love how that, I love that process, right? There's 2 things I have to get rid of. I have to get rid of the 1 that's added at the end, and I have to get rid of the 2 that's being multiplied before I can do my square root. So what would I do first according to algebra rules? Just subtract the 1. So you do your adding and subtracting first. So 2 times x plus 1 squared equals 10. Then what would I do? Ooh, you cannot distribute the 2 because it's squared, but we can divide it out. Okay, so you can divide out because you're currently multiplying, so opposite of multiplication would be division. So I'm left with x plus 1 squared equals 5. Now it looks exactly like the first couple, right? So square root both sides. And I'm left with x plus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 5. What's my final step? Subtract 1. Now, is this the problem where I can have 2 answers, or am I going to have 1 with a plus and minus? Okay, so you should have x equals negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 5. Are we okay with that? Yeah? Okay, so last problem. There's no curveball. You're going to try it, though. Step 1 was to add 4 to both sides. Right? You'll also notice that as I go through this, I am literally writing out every step so that I don't forget something and mess up pluses and minuses. Now, we know our mental math can be sketchy sometimes, so you have to decide whether it's worth it for you to do the mental math or to actually write things out. I recommend you write it out, but you don't listen to me anyway, so whatever. Okay, so then I have 3x plus 2 squared equals 24. What'd you do from there? Divide by 3. So x plus 2 squared equals 8. Then you took the square root of both sides. And most of you realized that you needed to simplify the square root of 8. That breaks down to 4 and 2 and 2 and 2. So I have a pair, 2 radical 2. I would simplify that radical before you do any plus or minus here. Okay, then you're going to subtract 2. And because it has a radical in the answer, you bring that negative 2 out front, plus or minus 2 square root of 2, which a lot of you were able to do on your own. Most of you even got to this part and just needed a little hint on how to fix it, or you had radical 8 here instead of 2 radical 2 and you just had to simplify that. Noah?
So I got that same answer, but like I'm still wondering like how come you wouldn't have just put the -2 like with the 2 that's after the plus 1?
Like, how come you don't add these together? Because this is a whole thing. Like, that's attached to the radical 2. So if this had a radical 2, you could combine like terms, but you can kind of think of this radical 2 as a variable, and those aren't the same because there's no variable quotation marks attached to this -2. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Not too bad, hopefully? No? Okay.